the light reactions. All right, so before we move into the specifics of the light reactions, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite figures in the entire textbook. Let me orient you to this beautiful, beautiful thing. Out here we have the stroma. Okay, that's one of the important spaces for photosynthesis. This membrane, it's a lovely phospholipid bilayer membrane, is the thylakoid membrane. And then we have in here in green the thylakoid space. It's beautiful. Now, as you'll notice, we have protein structures located within the thylakoid membrane. These protein structures are very important for the light reactions to occur. In particular, something called the photosystems. This is photosystem Roman numeral 2. This is photosystem Roman numeral 1. They are connected by an electron transport chain. We know what those do. And there's another electron transport chain coming off the end here of photosystem 1. So these photosystems in particular are light harvesting complexes. Let's take a look at one of these up close. So here we have our light coming in as a photon of energy, hitting the chlorophyll molecules in this protein complex of the photosystem. And the energy jumps from one chlorophyll molecule to the next, to the next, to the next, and it's funneled to these two special chlorophyll molecules in the very center of the photosystem. The very center of the photosystem is called the reaction center. And when that photon of energy hits the reaction center chlorophyll molecules, it excites the electron, or an electron, in those chlorophyll molecules so much that the electron physically leaves the chlorophyll molecules. And it is caught or harnessed by a part of the reaction center called the primary electron acceptor. It's kind of held there. Okay. So again, photon of energy from the sun coming in at a particular wavelength, bouncing from one chlorophyll molecule to the next in this protein complex, this light harvesting complex of the photosystem, going to the chlorophyll molecules, special chlorophyll molecules in the center of the photosystem called the reaction center, and then that energy being used to excite an electron and physically causing it to physically leave the chlorophyll molecules. Okay. So that occurs in both photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, as we will see throughout the process. Now those electrons, after they're jumped to their higher state and lost from the chlorophyll molecules, move down the electron transport chain to photosystem 1. And then they're put into another electron transport chain right after they leave photosystem 1. So let's take a look at the process of electrons moving from photosystem 2 through the electron transport chain, this first electron transport chain, to photosystem 1, and then through the second electron transport chain, and what all is involved in this process. You have this diagram in your assignment, and if I were you, I would have that assignment in front of me as you go through this explanation of these 8 steps of the photosystems and the light reactions in general. So if you want to pause, go ahead and pause, and or get out a notebook for these 8 steps as we roll through what all is going on. It looks very complex, but we're going to simplify it and go through it one step at a time. So we're going to start over here with our first photosystem. And the first thing that happens is, of course, like we said, light comes in, and light jumps from one chlorophyll molecule to the next, until it finally reaches those special chlorophyll molecules in the very center of the photosystem. And again, that energy is used to excite an electron from these chlorophyll molecules. The electron leaves the chlorophyll molecules. So now these chlorophyll molecules are electron deficient. They are in need of electrons. We'll get to that in just a bit. And that electron is caught by the primary electron acceptor. Okay. Now, why do they call it the P680? Well, the 680 refers to the wavelength of light that will excite electrons in these special chlorophyll molecules. 680, wavelength of light. All right. Okay, now we said that the electrons are lost, or electrons are lost from these special chlorophyll molecules. We need to replace those electrons somehow. How do we replace them? We replace them with electrons in the bonds of water. So here is where one of our major reactants comes into play. We break the water molecule, we tear it apart with an enzyme. An enzyme splits the water into oxygen and hydrogen ions. And we use those electrons in the bonds to replace the electrons that are lost from those special chlorophyll molecules in the P680 center. And in that process of using water, we produce one of our major products, oxygen, here in our first photosystem. Okay. And we also produce some hydrogen ions as well. All right, so our first electron transport chain, the electrons are transferred from the primary electron acceptor by an electron carrier to our proton pump, or our protein, cytochrome complex protein of the electron transport chain. And we'll talk about how ATP is ultimately produced as a result of that, but you probably already have a hunch or a clue as to what's going on in terms of making ATP. If you remember, the process that occurred in the mitochondria is very similar to the process that occurs here in the light reactions. But we'll talk more about making ATP at the end of the process. So electrons are pulled down the first electron transport chain, and they are pulled by an electron deficient special chlorophyll molecule or molecules in photosystem 1. So the electrons again are pulled down the electron transport chain, or the driving force for the electrons moving down the electron transport chain is a deficiency of electrons in this second photosystem's special chlorophyll A molecules. Because the electrons have been lost from this center as a result of light energy coming in, bouncing from one chlorophyll molecule to the next, as we saw in the other photosystem, and causing electrons to be lost because they're just so energized, they physically leave the chlorophyll molecules. And then this P700, wavelength 700 center. So this particular photosystem likes the wavelengths of light that come in to excite its electrons at about 700 nanometers. Slight difference here between these two photosystems. Okay? And then those electrons are jumped to their excited state, and they are caught by a primary electron acceptor. I'm going to pause this. Whoops, okay, we're back. And we're at the primary electron acceptor. Whoops, let's get this in the big screen here. All right. Now we look at our second electron transport chain, and these electrons are moved by an electron carrier from the primary electron acceptor to something called an NADP+ reductase. This is an enzyme that is going to reduce NADP+ to NADPH. Remember, gain electrons reduction. NADP+ is going to gain electrons and be reduced to NADPH. Okay. All right, so how do we make ATP? We understand how we make NADPH, okay, but then that other major product for the Calvin cycle, ATP. Well, remember as we move electrons down this first electron transport chain from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1, electrons are moving down the electron transport chain, and as a result, hydrogen ions are pumped from the stroma to the thylakoid membrane, making a high concentration of hydrogen ions. You also have hydrogen ions from the splitting of water, and the only way these hydrogen ions can get out and back into the stroma to kind of even out, because remember there's a lot more hydrogen ions in here in the thylakoid space than we have in the stroma. The only way they can get out is through an ATP synthase. And as we know, as hydrogen ions move through an ATP synthase, they turn that ATP synthase like a turbine, not a turbine, a turbine. And they allow that enzyme to make ATP from ADP and phosphate. So now we have ATP in the stroma, NADPH in the stroma, and we're going to use those two major products of the light reactions to power the Calvin cycle.